Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a UK political update, actually involves some US politics as well. There has been something of a fracas in the media domain over the last, well, I'd say the last day, but actually the last 2 or 3 days concerning an attack on the BBC from essentially everyone on the right, including Donald Trump, Caroline Levitt in the White House as their press secretary, the Daily Telegraph, Boris Johnson, everyone from Reform, all piling onto the BBC over a controversy concerning the editing of a Panorama documentary before Trump was made president or before the elections last year. What I want to do, because it's you guys, some of you will be from the UK and will know this, some of you will disagree with what I'm going to say, but please listen to my context first. And many of you from outside the UK won't understand fully the context of the BBC and where it sits. You will hear things, and many British people will repeat things about the BBC without really understanding where the BBC sits. So I need to explain the context before we go into the details of what's happened and how it involves Trump and the Director General stepping down from the BBC as well as others. Or one other. So lots of people think the BBC is left wing, and many on the left think it's right wing. And the reality is it probably sits somewhere in the middle. I've said this many times. I will tell you again. People often look at the BBC and say, "Oh, look, there are a bunch of Black and Asian people on this drama, or there's a gay person here, or this and that," and they'll look at social dimensions of the BBC in terms of drama and the programming and say it is liberal. There is a liberal bias because of all these culture things that are going on. Very much kind of culture wars topic area, the BBC. But in reality, when we're talking about politics, it is not a left-wing organization in terms of the politics programming and the news discussion and reporting. That's really important. So don't look at the drama and the social side of the BBC, because it's very important. It does all this programming. It is a huge part of the British media landscape. But don't look at this area of the BBC and then extrapolate that over to its news reporting and analysis. What you'll actually find is the news analysis on the BBC is somewhat vacuous. You go to the United States, you watch Fox News, and it's all full of opinion. You watch MSNBC, it's full of opinion. They will be reporting the news, but they'll be absolutely slanting it overtly to a political bias. In fact, Fox News often talks in terms of our, or we need to do this, as if Fox News is part of the right-wing media landscape, like MSNBC will do for the left, okay? BBC just does not do that. It cannot do that. And it has to show impartiality, and it is regulated by Ofcom, which is the government regulator for comms for the BBC. It has a charter as well, and it has this board of directors that supposedly maintain its objectiveness, its neutrality in terms of it's reporting, and it has to fairly represent both sides. It does an awful lot of things that are very, very technical things when it's reporting on, certain by-elections, and then or special election. It has to, report everyone who is up for everyone who's a candidate in that election. It has to do this, has to do that, has to jump through hoops. That is kind of tightly regulated. Okay. When you actually look at its political appointments, you will actually notice that they do sit generally on the right. Now, people on the right will completely scoff at what I'm going to say, but the simple fact of the matter is look at the appointments. So we can talk about all sorts. Laura Kunsberg, the political, actually, is it Chris Mason now, the political editor? But both of those sit on the right. You have what Nick Robinson at Oxford University was head of the Conservative Party students. You've got John Humphreys at Radio 4. You've got Andrew Neil, huge political right winger that had the politics show on the BBC for so many years. I mean, I could name all sorts of political appointments, even Fiona Bruce on BBC Question Time, all sorts of political appointments who sit broadly on the right. The BBC is a political football between the left and the right. And always has been. The right want to defund it. They don't want a public service broadcaster. It's small government. Why are we paying a license fee? So everyone has to pay a license fee for the BBC. And, you know, in order to watch television legally, you had to pay this license fee, and that's what funds the BBC. And they are a public service broadcaster, and they have to do a whole bunch of things in order to be able to operate as the BBC, as a public service broadcaster. And this means that when a left-wing government comes in, say a Labour government comes in, they are genuinely going to support the BBC. Like, ideologically, the Labour will never kind of have a go at the BBC or make any moves to defund it. When the Conservatives come in, that's always on their agenda. Their supporters kind of want that. And what that means is the BBC panders more to the right, because for obvious reasons. We don't need to pander to the left because they will keep us funded ideologically. But if we are too nasty to the right, I'm not talking about comedy programs, I'm talking about, and actually we can talk about comedy programs, we'll come to that in a second. But in terms of news broadcasting, if we slant slightly to the right, then we will appease the Conservatives, who will then keep our license fee situation going, and the BBC will continue to be funded. And that's really what you've seen. Arguably, you know, the BBC panders to the Conservatives more than it does to Labour in the news areas. Now, in comedy, it's always been a case that the comedy programs, you know, generally punch up. They have a go at privilege. They have a go at power, received power as well, inherited power and wealth. Those are all the kind of ideas that you are more likely to take the mickey out of from a comedy point of view, and therefore the Conservative Party is more aligned with that kind of world, then it will be the case that comedy is more likely to skew liberal. Now, people have been frustrated about this who sit on the right, but it's just generally the nature of comedy that is better suited, I think, to the left. I wrote some articles on this some time ago. However, the BBC recently, under the Conservative Party, before Labour got in, said, okay, this isn't good enough. We need more right-wing comedy on the BBC, or there's too much left-wing comedy. So the MASH report, for example, got cancelled famously. And Nish Kumar said, you know, essentially this is an example of censorship from the right. And you had Mock the Week was also cancelled, and it's a hugely popular comedy show, a news-based comedy show, and that was famously cancelled as part of this move to get rid of more liberal comedy, or at least balance the books a little bit in terms of comedy. But generally, in terms of news reporting, I would argue that it's quite vacuous. It generally doesn't cast enough opinion, or it doesn't cast any opinion, because that's kind of the remit for the BBC. And when you compare it to GB News, for example, or Talk TV, but GB News is this new upstart Fox News type news channel. It's chalk and cheese. It really, really is. Sky News is somewhat similar to the BBC, and since it's not Murdoch anymore, it's now owned by, is it part of Comcast? I don't know, but anyway, Sky News is actually fairly neutral as well. Probably marginally, you know, you think of people like Adam Bolton, marginally skews to the right. Okay, so that's what I would say about the BBC. It is a political football between these two sides, and the right loves to hate the BBC. And that includes, or particularly is reflected by the behavior of the Daily Mail the Daily Express, and as these newspapers have become more populist, the Daily Telegraph and the Times, right? But the Daily Telegraph particularly, it seems to have become much more populist recently, and much more almost tabloidy to a degree. Anyway, let's go through what has actually happened. So there's your context. Now let's talk about what the Telegraph has been involved in. And here's a great example of where the Telegraph really sits with regard to the BBC. So this is the front page of the Telegraph website, and all the top news pieces are on the BBC. So BBC in crisis, BBC bias dossier, Tim Davie resigns, Trump speech doctored, anti-Israel bias, trans coverage censored, BBC to apologise, the memo in full, app selection bias, racism accusations. Trump thanks. So Tim Davie quits after the Telegraph found a broadcast that misled viewers. Trump thanks the Telegraph for revealing doctored speech. As Director General, I have to take ultimate responsibility. That's a quote from Tim Davie. The CEO of News, Deborah Turnus, has also resigned. Under here, Trump thanks the Telegraph for exposing the BBC bias. Tim Stanley writes, the broadcaster's future is now in doubt. Danny Cohen writes, this is a crisis point for the BBC. Its gaslighting of Jews must end. And how the Telegraph's revelations made Director General's position untenable, writes Gordon Rayner. So that's where the Telegraph is. And this is how important this news piece is in the entire kind of, all over the media landscape. This is absolutely huge. And I would argue this is actually more important than many will understand it to be. If you look at, say, the Guardian, that's obviously skews to the left. Tim Davie resigns as BBC Director General after accusations of serious and systemic bias in coverage. I take ultimate responsibility. Tim Davie, the marketing man who became the BBC's Director General. How a week of hostile headlines from right-wing media led to resignations. And why is the BBC expected to apologise after the Donald Trump speech edit? So that's how both sides are reporting it, as just a snapshot. I'm actually going to read this explainer from the Guardian, because I think it's a good way of explaining this to particularly those who live abroad from the UK. Why is the BBC expected to apologise over a Donald Trump speech edit? Boris Johnson and the White House criticised the corporation, but some journalists say criticism is part of a campaign to destroy the BBC. So the BBC is expected to apologise on Monday for the way in which a speech by the US President Donald Trump was edited in an episode of Panorama. That's a flagship documentary programme on the BBC. The show is one of a number of examples highlighted by Michael Prescott, and this guy's really important here for what has taken place. A former external advisor to the BBC's editorial standards committee, who detailed his concerns about the broadcaster's impartiality in a memo published by the Telegraph. So this is why the Telegraph's involved. They've published this memo by Michael Prescott, and we'll see where he sits in a second. So details of a dossier compiled by Prescott were published in the Telegraph over the course of last week. The main criticism of Prescott's memo focused on an edition of Panorama broadcast a week before the US election. He accused the BBC of selectively editing a Trump speech. Prescott also raised concerns about BBC Arabic. He claimed that a review of BBC journalist David Grossman had highlighted, quote, systemic problems within BBC Arabic that represented anti-Israel bias. The 19-page dossier, so as a public service broadcaster, this is me speaking, there are different BBC entities that report around the world. So BBC Arabic will be appealing to, this is a public service broadcaster, so it's a little bit like Voice of America, the BBC. It is our kind of propaganda arm and our information arm outside of the UK. So BBC World Service is an incredibly important radio service and televisual service for the rest of the world. But you get, BBC Russia, for example, BBC Ukraine, BBC Arabic, that's appealing to that area of the world, and will be reporting in a way that's trying to also sell people, ideals of Britain. But the claim is that BBC Arabic might have had a systemic problems with anti-Israel bias, according to Michael Prescott. The 19-page dossier is also reported to have criticised the BBC's coverage of transgender issues, saying the broadcaster has been quote, captured by a small group of staff promoting the Stonewall view of gender identity issues, and that is its LGBT desk would, quote, decline to cover any stories raising difficult questions. Okay, so who's Michael Prescott? So Prescott is a former journalist who went on to become a corporate advisor. His roles included 10 years as chief political correspondent and then political editor of the Sunday Times. So already, like, okay, so we know Michael Prescott is going to be sitting on the right. He's in a Murdoch newspaper, broadsheet Murdoch newspaper for 10 years as their chief political correspondent and then political editor of the Sunday Times. You know, okay. 8 years as corporate affairs director for BT. He holds a role at Hanover Communications and used to be an advisor to the BBC committee overseeing editorial guidelines and standards. Sources have told The Guardian that Robbie Gibb, who served as director of communications to Theresa May. So Theresa May, Conservative Prime Minister's director of comms in Downing Street between 2017 and 2019, was instrumental in the appointment of Prescott as an advisor to the BBC's editorial guidelines and standards committee. So the Tories were ruling the UK for 14 years, and in that time they would have been putting people in place in the BBC that represent their political outlook. And they were trying to change, like, for example, getting the comedy to realign and not be so liberally biased or skewed, and so on and so forth. They put people in these positions who will do things that align with their own ideology. And one of these is the appointment of Michael Prescott. So when he comes out with the dossier saying that the BBC is biased, you've got to understand that he himself is biased and will be like everyone is. Everyone's biased, right? I'm not saying he's particularly biased, but he has an agenda, and his agenda will be a right-wing agenda, right? Because that's the world that he's come from. He's then appointed as an external influence on the BBC on their editorial guidelines, then sees him doing things that he disagrees with. Then he writes a dossier and releases it to the Daily Telegraph. So you're thinking, okay, is this a kind of a hit job? You know, what's his agenda here? Is this a classic, you know, conservative aligned hit job on the BBC? Probably. But does what he say have merit? Quite possibly. Okay, so both things can be true, and we'll come back to this idea in a little while. So the pair, this is Gibb and Prescott, are reported to be friends. Concerns have previously been raised about the role of Gibb, who joined the BBC board when Boris Johnson was in Downing Street. So this is Boris Johnson period guy, yeah, affecting the appointment of Michael Prescott, so on and so forth. So what happened with the Trump edit? Well, Prescott's concerns regarded clips edited together from sections of the US president's speech on the 6th of January 2021. So this is the January the 6th insurrection, when he was standing up, remember, and speaking about, you know, marching to the Capitol. And what happened was, so this is the documentary Trump, A Second Chance. It's broadcast on the BBC a week before last year's election, US election. The edited clip suggests that Trump told the crowd, quote, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell." But the words were taken from sections of his speech almost an hour apart. So it's like, not that he didn't say these things, but the words, you know, were, yeah, there was some kind of dubiousness as to the interpretation of what he was saying, or maybe what wasn't included. So it did not include a section in which Trump said he wanted supporters, quote, "to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." So I don't think this is actually massively serious, because at the end of the day, Trump also, for like, what was it, 2-3 hours, didn't call off the insurrection, didn't call off the marches. There was an impeachment over this. You know, it's all out there. Trump clearly was in support of the people who were protesting on January 6th. I mean, this is not controversial at all. But from a technical point of view, you know, Trump doesn't like, since he found out about it, actually, it's Prescott here, doesn't like the way that this was edited. And the reaction has been basically the left, well, the right, just absolutely piling in on the BBC. Prescott's memo has led to criticism of the BBC from senior conservatives. Boris Johnson told the Telegraph, so Boris Johnson has gone to town, right? He's told the Telegraph that the corporation's Director General, Tim Davie, must either explain or resign. He said the BBC has been caught red-handed in multiple acts of left-wing bias. The Tory party leader at the moment, Kemi Badenoch, has said heads should roll. Johnson posted on social media last week, is anyone in the BBC going to take responsibility and resign? Trump's press secretary, Caroline Levitt, described the BBC as 100% fake news and a propaganda machine after the allegations emerged. So this is not going down well. Others have put the row down to the right-wing press's ideological obsession with undermining the BBC. And this is absolutely true, at least as well. You know, if you believe all of what Boris Johnson and Caroline Levitt are saying, it's also true that this is definitely an attempt to destroy the BBC. The BBC presenter, Nick Robinson, who is the former political editor and is right-wing himself, right? But when you work for the BBC, you're naturally going to defend the BBC, generally. The BBC presenter Nick Robinson said on the Today programme on Radio 4 that there was a genuine concern regarding the broadcaster's editorial standards and mistakes. However, he said he believed there was a political campaign by people who want to destroy the organisation. We're going to return to Nick Robinson's claims in a second. The veteran broadcaster John Simpson said Robinson was exactly right. The British journalist Adam Bolton, so Sky News, former political editor of Sky News, who is skewed to the right, said on X that he thought claims of bias on this occasion were BS. So that's interesting that Adam Bolton, who, you know, not a BBC person, skews to the right, Sky News says that actually claims of bias are BS, adding it was fake news to suggest Donald Trump did not egg on what happened on the 6th of January. And that is so important. Like, the documentary didn't skew Trump's position on January the 6th. That was totally clear. What it did is it may have like left a sentence out, which I think would have been important to add, by the way. So there is potentially a little bit of disingenuousness to a point, but actually it didn't distort at all the kind of narrative of January the 6th and I think the truth of where Donald Trump sat. I think that's important. So anyway, Tim Davie, who's the Director General, has now announced his resignation, along with the head of BBC News, Deborah Turnus. Now, what's interesting here is that these two people, particularly Tim Davie, was accused of having a bit of a right-wing bias, right? So appointed during the Conservative years, right? And then was looking at, I mean, he oversaw like the cancelling of Mock the Week and the MASH report and so on and so forth. Lots of people on the left are like, oh my goodness, Tim Davie is biased to the right. He has now fallen foul of the right and essentially been cancelled. And there's a kind of a weird irony there. Anyway, let's now go to Russia. So Kirill Dmitriev. Oh my goodness. So Kirill Dmitriev comes out and says Trump is going after fake news BBC and British leftist propaganda machine. Levitt called the BBC 100% fake news as she criticised how British people are forced to fund a leftist propaganda machine. Epiphany, or have they seen my X posts about fake UK news? Emoji. And he posted a screen grab on the Telegraph. Trump goes to war with fake news BBC. White House attacks leftist propaganda machine over biased doctoring of president's speech. The Kremlin are here for it. If you find yourself on the same side as the Kremlin, just check yourself, right? So if you're someone that is loving this because the BBC is getting a right pasting, but you also are very mindful of the Kremlin and Putin, just have a think about what's going on here. The undermining of the BBC is entirely what the Kremlin does want, completely to their benefit. The BBC, as a public service broadcaster, is always going to be the enemy of, well, I would say, the ideological right in terms of the small governments, low tax, so on and so forth, kind of ideology. But I would say that's where Trump is, but actually Trump's all over the place because he's trying to do these communist, socialist grabs of corporate entities in the US, where he's taking 10% here, 15% there, and whatever. Like, where is Trump's ideology? I don't know. It's just, I guess he's dictatorial, autocratic. So, you know, whether it be left or right, he wants power. But yeah, I think it's important to note where the Russians sit on this. Now, Trump has come out and said on True Social, the top people in the BBC, including Tim Davie, the boss, are all quitting or fired because they were caught doctoring my good, perfect speech of January the 6th. Thank you to the Telegraph for exposing these corrupt journalists. These are very dishonest people who tried, I mean, they're not journalists, by the way, who tried to step on the scales of the presidential election. On top of everything else, they are from a foreign country, one that many consider our number one ally. What a terrible thing for democracy. So this is serious, right? You've got Trump weighing in. Lewis Goodall from LBC says, Donald Trump has posted on True Social about Tim Davies' resignation. He claims his speech on January 6th was perfect. He just leaves it there. Now, Rupert Lowe is an MP. He was with Reform. He is arguably to the right of Reform. Some of what he's saying at the moment on Twitter, Rupert Lowe, is vomit-inducing. But he had an argument with Nigel Farage, and he's now independent. He might be, is he affiliated with Advance UK, or is he starting his own political party? Anyway, he's essentially is Reform, but he's not Reform anymore. But the reason I show you what Rupert Lowe is saying is because this is indicative of Reform, the right, the Conservatives, and how they're going to town on this. Trump defeats the BBC, says Rupert Lowe MP. What a hero. And I just opened Twitter, and I haven't done anything. This is my Twitter feed, and I'm just going to read you through my Twitter feed. And it says, or I think all you need to know about how nuts this is. Rupert Lowe, again, proud to be the one of the vocal minority who detested the BBC long before that was the settled view of the British people. So this idea that now the British people hate the BBC, and you see people are trying to whip up a storm. Boris Johnson has said he's not going to pay his license fee. That's a former prime minister saying he's not going to pay his license fee. He's giving permission for anyone on the right not to pay their license fee. And you could just get a massive, I don't know what the BBC would do with that. Like they would lose so much funding just by refusals, which is, you know, you're breaking the law. I don't know if it's the law, you're breaking the rules. This is genuinely potentially a very big crisis. When you look at the groundswell of opinion online, it is being driven by these kind of voices. And a Sabine MP here says, on the other hand, this is Lib Dem MP for Fruman Somerset West, says, East Somerset, sorry. Tim Davies' resignation from the BBC is deeply worrying. It raises serious questions about whether bad actors are interfering in the BBC's independence. The BBC is a cornerstone of the British media. We want it to be the best it can be. That's why we supported the license fee. Public funding should protect journalism from misinformation and Trump-style populism. Do you see where the argument is here? This is honestly, and I'm very strongly in support of what Anna Sabine is saying, by the way. I think the BBC has to be, it's so freaking important, the BBC. It does all sorts of things. I could bore you about how important it is in education, both Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and Key Stage 3 education in the UK. It is insanely important as a public service for the things it does outside of just programming. And again, you know, in foreign countries as well. But yeah, we cannot let those protections be eroded. The BBC must stay independent and focused on proportionate, accurate journalism that serves the public, not political interests. If you look at, and I'd be interested to see now with stuff like this, but in recent surveys or surveys over decades, the BBC is seen as the most reliable news source, or one of the most reliable news sources, routinely, you know, year in, year out, despite what some people over here might say. Then John Simpson, who's a legendary BBC journalist, says the BBC is facing a coordinated, politically motivated attack. And that is an opinion piece. Ed Davey, the leader of the Lib Dems, says, I have my disagreements with the BBC under Tim Davey, but he was a decent man doing a difficult job. To see Trump's White House claiming credit for his downfall and attacking the BBC should worry us all. That is absolutely correct, by the way. And then we've got Restore Britain saying defunding the BBC will be glorious. You've got Ofcom, the regulator, saying, bring out a statement on Tim Davies' resignation. We're going to come back to Ofcom in a second. Then, I mean, this is the sort of thing I read day in, day out. So Keir Starmer as a prime minister laying wreath a wreath of poppies on Remembrance Sunday. Did anyone else feel physically sick watching Starmer lay down that wreath? How dare he, after his utter betrayal? Have some shame. You have disrespected and betrayed our veterans. You've destroyed this country and attacked us. You will never kill our patriotism. I mean, this just, and I see other people saying, I've never seen a prime minister attacked for laying a wreath on Remembrance Sunday before. Like, but why I read this and didn't just go over it is what you're seeing with the BBC at the moment. You've got this pitch battle going on between the left and the right. That is, Gracie, I doubt is a British person, right? It's probably a Russian troll. Or it could well be a British person, but the level of vitriol at the moment online is something I've never seen in my life before. You've heard me talk about it lots over the last couple of weeks. It is getting worse with every passing day. Keir Starmer is being so vitriolically attacked at the moment that I honestly is staggering. BBC News, Brendan May from the left here saying BBC News has been an absolute bin fire for well over a decade, starting with its woefully shallow coverage of the run-up to Brexit. There's someone saying that Brexit shouldn't have happened, and the BBC actually, but when you get attacked from the left and the right, it means you probably are someone in the somewhere in the centre. It was then hijacked by right-wing ideologues. Many of its most talented journalists left, and frankly, the whole thing needs rebuilding from scratch. By the way, when I listed a bunch of, and many of you won't know these people, when I talk about Laura Kunsberg, Chris Mason, Nick Robinson, John Humphreys, you might not know these people. But rest assured that almost all of the political editors and analysts have been on the right. James O'Brien, who is now this firebrand liberal on LBC, and I've shown you some of his videos before. I like him quite a lot. I agree with almost everything he says. He was on BBC Newsnight as one of their presenters, not their full one, but one of their presenters, and he was kicked off BBC Newsnight for being too liberal, right? So, which is fascinating. So hang on, James O'Brien gets kicked off, but Andrew Neil has his flagship TV show and so on. So if you want to understand where the BBC have tried to align themselves politically, I think that is very, very revealing. Suella Braverman, who's a former Home Secretary she's my local MP. She's a Conservative. I detest her. She says, quite right, Tim Davies set to resign, blah, blah, blah. Quite right. Now scrap the licence fee. So you've now got the Conservatives outright calling for the licence fee to be scrapped, for the BBC to be done with. That is, you think of how the BBC is one of the most recognised institutions in the world, full stop, in the world. And Suella Braverman's like, yeah, get rid of it, burn it to the ground. This is kind of the rise of this populist right that the Conservative Party now, I don't think is any different from Reform, realistically. Got Chris Bryant. This is interesting. This is what I was saying earlier. In the 24 years I've been an MP, I've never known people on social media attack MPs of all persuasions for laying wreaths on Remembrance Sunday until today. Remembrance should be beyond politics. We should be in unity. We should in unity respect the sacrifice of our armed forces, not indulge in vitriol. There you go. I'm using the term vitriol loads. Richard Corbett, years of right-wing bias in BBC News and Current Affairs, and nothing happens. So this is my position. Like, the BBC has been biased towards the right in quite subtle ways. You see the way BBC Newsnight had, what's her name? Pfizer. She's an economist. And it's really interesting the way that we have Matthew Goodwin on BBC Newsnight 2 weeks ago. Matt Goodwin, who was called an author and an academic because he had been at the University of Kent and he's now on GB News. He's got a book out and he is like overtly racist and really kind of populist right wing at the moment, super reform. And he's called an author and academic. And Pfizer, I forget her name. She's an economist, an actual economist, and she was called was she called an economist? Economist and activist. She wasn't called an academic. She was called an activist. So if you're on the left, you're an activist, but if you're on the right, you're an academic. Okay, interesting. So people were pointing out that there are really subtle biases that go on that show that the programming for the BBC does skew itself to the right. And this is why people like Richard Corbett are saying years of right-wing bias in the BBC news and current affairs. Again, we're not talking about drama and programming, and nothing happens, but upset Trump and the Tory Director General resigns. So the Director General, Tim Davie, seen as a Tory, he has to resign because Trump attacks the BBC. Where power lies in Britain, Badenoch Johnson, the Daily Mail wanted the Director General Tim Davies' head as part of their long-standing campaign against the BBC. Lisa Nandy's support was inadequate. Yes, a panorama edit shouldn't have happened, but this is wildly disproportionate. A bad day. John Sopel, who's a great journalist, really, really like him. The former Apprentice host says, "You're fired," and out go the Director General and the news CEO over a dumb, moronic panorama edit. Why on earth didn't the BBC simply apologise when this first came to light? Whole thing seems bizarre. Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservative Party, is right that Tim Davie and Deborah Turness have finally taken responsibility and resigned from the BBC. But let's be honest, this has been a catalogue of serious failures that runs far deeper. By the way, he was in charge for 14 years. Who was in charge then? Oh, it was your party, right? Of course. The Prescott report exposed institutional bias that cannot be swept away with 2 resignations. Strong action must be taken on all the issues it raised. The culture at the BBC has not yet changed. BBC Arabic must be brought under urgent control. The BBC's US and Middle East coverage needs a full overhaul. And on basic matters of biology, the corporation can no longer allow its output to be shaped by a cabal of ideological activists. The new leadership must now deliver genuine reform of the culture of the BBC top to bottom, because it should not expect the public to keep funding it through a compulsory license fee unless it can finally demonstrate true impartiality. And then David Yelland, who is associated with the BBC. The fall of Tim Davie is a victory for populists, for a cabal of toxic plotters with links to the BBC board who designed and executed a coup and the circular firing squad in the UK press. It is not a good day for our values or our country. And then, someone, John O'Connell, 2 senior members of the BBC have resigned, both Tories appointed by Boris Johnson. That lefty BBC myth, really important point I keep trying to make. Now the board responsible for oversight need to resign. The board that is mostly Tories appointed by Boris Johnson. Just absolutely incredible. I'm glad the US, Liz Truss, the former prime minister of the UK for however many days. I'm glad the US president and the rest of the world are seeing the BBC for what it is. So she's become this firebrand, outspoken Trump populist. Its failure to tell the truth on everything from transgender ideology to economics to Gaza has done huge damage to politics and government in this country. She says economics because she was done. The reason she was kicked out was because of her economics, her budget, disastrous budget. This should be the end of nationalized broadcasting. Just absolutely, and on it goes. So Boris Johnson is right at the heart of this. All these different news pieces. Marina Wheeler, Davie must explain the BBC dossier or resign, says Boris. Boris Johnson explodes as he rages over BBC's left-wing bias, says the Daily Express. Independent, the BBC bias around Nick Robinson and Boris Johnson clash as a corporation to apologise over the Trump speech edit. So we have the Daily Mail then leads with Boris's blast at arrogant Nick Robinson, the former political editor for the BBC, for claiming bias row is an anti-BBC plot. So remember, Nick Robinson himself is a right-wing journalist, I would argue, and Boris, but says that while there are issues with the BBC that we're working on, this is an anti-BBC plot. And then Boris Johnson goes crazy at him. So Nick Robinson then replies to this headline saying, "Hands up all those who think Boris Johnson is well placed to lecture anyone else on upholding standards and admitting mistakes." Boris Johnson famous for not having standards, lying compulsively. In fact, he lost 3 jobs over lying. One as a newspaper journalist, one as a prime minister, and one as a secretary of something when he wasn't prime minister. Was it under Howard? he was done for lying. So anyway, as I said this morning, says Nick Robinson on BBC Radio 4 Today programme, it's clear that there is a genuine concern about editorial standards and mistakes. There's also a political campaign by people who want to destroy the organisation. Both things are happening at the same time. He then says, we live in a time of deep divisions about politics and culture, Gaza, Israel, trans and women's rights, Donald Trump's policies and politics, to name just three. The BBC, like many public organisations, faces competing pressures about how we should navigate these treacherous waters. We, like others, undoubtedly make mistakes. We, like others, need to listen and learn. We can and will do better, but we should stand up to those who prefer propaganda and disinformation. Boom. That, honestly, if I could sum this whole video into a paragraph, that's it. That is it. We can and will do better, but we should stand up to those who prefer propaganda and disinformation. To be clear, I don't speak for the BBC. I do, however, hope I speak for many who work in it, watch and listen and read what we report, and who want to see the BBC thrive in an era of propaganda and disinformation. I look forward to hearing what the chairman of the BBC will say in response to legitimate concerns which have been raised, but I have no idea what he plans to say, nor did he or any other of my bosses know what I said on air today or here on X. So yeah, this is sort of typical kind of comment, I think, that I broadly agree with. Johnson appointed a conservative-leaning board, including pro-Zionist Robbie Gibb, who then got in Michael Prescott, who made this dossier and complaint. Why are the BBC over-promoting reform and Farage, which they are doing all the time at the moment, when he has been calling to defund the BBC and privatise it for years? The BBC is a mouthpiece for right-wing ideology. They removed the Tory critics. Yeah. So, okay. Then we get this other kind of sidebar thing. So Lisa Nandy here saying it isn't news, it's opinion and polemic. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy tells Lewis Goodall she is disappointed in Ofcom for not taking action on politicians presenting the news. Now, she's not talking, this has nothing to do with the BBC, what she is saying here, although it is tangentially. But I just had to bring this in because it's super, super important. So basically, the Ofcom seeks to regulate the news channels and amongst other things. And we now have GB News on the scene that has a show. It is part owned by Nigel Farage, right? GB News, literally part owned by Nigel Farage. He has 500,000 shares in it or whatever. And that should be not allowed, okay? As he's now he's an MP, elected MP, and in charge of Reform UK. So he's in charge of one particular political party. He part owns GB News. That's why he went out to the committee hearing in the United States recently. He went out not just to do that, but also to start the channel up in the United States, start the US program from GB News out there. He presents a news show on GB News. Right, this is something that's supposedly not allowed to happen. Ofcom have ruled that our rules are clear that politicians may not present news programs unless exceptionally justified, and our recently updated guidance puts this beyond doubt. So they've ruled that he is fine doing that, and GB News shouldn't be held to account. Meanwhile, a tiny bit of editing over here, and you've lost the Director General of the BBC and the CEO of News, right? That's happened, but Nigel Farage is cool with reporting, with presenting a news show on a news TV channel, and they get away with that because I think they claimed it's not kind of a news channel, it's entertainment or something like that, even though it's called GB News. I 1,000,000% agree with that. I think it's wrong that on a news channel, seemingly a news show, I mean, they'll argue, oh, it's an opinion show or whatever, is presented by a politician from one part. It's just essentially that then becomes a propaganda channel for reform, which it is anyway. I mean, all the reporters and all the presenters are just reform junkies, by and large. So yeah. Can you explain how a station called GB News appears on the EPG under News, identifies as Britain's news channel on the top of its website, has won awards and boasts about being a top news channel, is not a news channel, Ofcom? Or am I misunderstanding? And then why does Farage own 500,000 shares in GB News and regularly present a news show? You've allowed them to blur the lines of entertainment and news to circumnavigate your rules. If Keir Starmer, Ed Davey, or Zach Polanski had a regular TV show on a British TV channel, you'd stop that nonsense sharpage, or on a news channel, I'd argue. Your organisation's lack of action over Nigel Farage's GB News programme is a sign of your organisation's utter corruption. Ofcom is clearly compromised. So we are seeing a pitched battle in the news landscape in the UK. And at the moment, the right is winning. The right is winning hands down. David Yelland, I'm sorry, this is lunacy. Firstly, Nick Robinson. So he's replying to the Daily Mail saying Boris Johnson, Boris's blaster arrogant Nick Robinson for claiming Bias Rao is an anti-BBC plot. He says, I'm sorry, this is lunacy. Firstly, Nick Robinson is entirely right. Secondly, he was balanced in what he said anyway. And thirdly, this is not front page news. It is instead an ideological obsession. So I mean, the Daily Mail is the biggest selling newspaper in the UK, and is when I go to my newsagent, I live in a kind of a lot of old conservative people live around here, but I go to the one stop down there, and there is literally one Guardian there that they have of a day, and when the Daily Mail gets delivered, I think particularly at the weekend, it is taller than my body. They have a pile of Daily Mails there. Every single one of those readers is reading negatively about the BBC. And that is just poisoning the public. It's been happening for decades, but it is so overt now. It is so overt. And that quote from Nick Robinson I read earlier, living in a time of deep divisions where we need to stand up to propaganda and disinformation. I can't tell you how important that statement is. And John Simpson, again, he's exactly right. There is genuine concern about editorial standards and mistakes. There's also a political campaign by people who want to destroy the organization that you are currently listening to. Both things are happening at the same time. And John Simpson also adds, again, you know, he's a bit of a legend, John Simpson. Tim Davie was one of the best director generals the BBC has had, and Deborah Turness was a brilliant head of news. Only the BBC's enemies could possibly be glad that they've resigned. We've now got a real fight on our hands to defend public service broadcasting because that's under threat too. 100% John Simpson. 100%. It is pretty incredible. Anyway, I just thought I'd give you a real sense, hopefully an accurate sense of what's going on here. Do not fixate on a little bit of editing that actually really wasn't that serious. And yet there's going to be, almost certainly there's going to be some issues with finding it difficult to report on transgender issues because people don't understand it. You're like, oh, is this guy? That's how I understand what the issue is with the transgender, where you've got maybe a bunch of people within the organization that like don't want to upset this kind of people, so they didn't present things that could ruffle feathers, maybe. And with BBC Arabic, you know, there might be, you know, there will be biases in the BBC. Of course there will be. And that's kind of my point, is that, yeah, okay, we can accept these biases. And as long as you're striving to do something about it, you're listening to people and you're reacting. But on account of that tiny bit of editing, you are kicking out the director general and the head of the CEO of news. This is an attack. This is a coup. This is a ideological crusade against the BBC, and they've succeeded. I think Ofcom needs to get some real teeth. And at the moment, you've got BBC News that sits in the middle, Sky News that sits in the middle, and then you've got GB News that sits really far over to the right, and you've got Talk TV for what that does. That is essentially right-leaning as well. I've already talked to you previously about the newspaper situation in the UK. You've got something like 9 titles on the right and 2 on the left. You've got the Guardian and the Mirror that have relatively tiny circulations. You've got the Daily Mail. You've got the Daily Express. You've got the Sun. You've got the Times. You've got the Telegraph. You've got the Spectator. You've got the Evening Standard. You've got the Financial Times. You've got all of these papers sit on the right. They sit on the left. And so you've got a massive skew in the print media landscape. You've got a massive skew online with Twitter, with Facebook, with all of these social media platforms. And then, you could argue Jeff Bezos and blah, blah, blah. They are algorithmically supporting the right. You look at Twitter, my feed, outside I've got a load of BBC things there, and actually there's quite a few from both sides, interestingly, but that would have been because I've liked a bunch of those, and so it's kind of changed the algorithm a little bit. But my goodness, I have just tons of people with pure hatred attacking Keir Starmer right up and down my feeds the whole time. There is an algorithmic bias on X, which we know. There's been investigations done in the UK. Sky News has just done one. Germany just done one with AFD, and the US has done a similar investigation. It's clear. The data is in. X, Twitter is biased. And I would argue, TV news in general, and because TV news they're owned by massive corporations. This is why public service broadcasts are super important, because otherwise your news is delivered to you by people who are answerable to profit. Therefore, infotainment, polemic is exactly the same as the algorithms online, which is how do we get people continuing to be here? Well, we give them what we think they want rather than the truth in the news. It's like, how do we skew this so that they're either like, and we've seen this with the algorithms on Facebook and other social media platforms, is they end up polarizing. You send people into these silos that they struggle to get out of, and that's what's happening that's what will generally happen when you don't have public service broadcasters that try and set a course of objectivity. There is like, well, we're not interested in objectivity. We're interested in clicks and advertising revenue and bums on seats and eyes on screen and making profits. Objective news ain't part of it. It's about making profits. So you look at what's happened with CBS recently, what's happening with ABC, it appears, and kowtowing and money, and CNN possibly being taken over as Paramount, Skydance have merged. That affects CBS, and they're looking at taking over Warner Bros., which owns CNN. So you're thinking all this consolidation. You've got Sinclair Media and Nexstar in the US, local networks and carriers that are massively skewed to the right. And you're thinking, my goodness, it's just a political quagmire news in the US. And it's just, I think, although it's expensive and you've got to find ways of funding this, I think public service broadcasting is incredibly important, more so possibly now than ever, arguably, given the prevalence of disinformation. So I feel very strongly about this, and this is definitely an ideological crusade against the BBC, and they'll be exacerbating one. They'll be amplifying how much of a problem these biases and these issues were for their own political, ideological ends. Just be warned. That's my tuppence, but I am, of course, biased as well. So take it for what you think it is. Appreciate your support. Take care. Speak to you soon.